So I have just got home from my adventures in the United States of America, and if I've learned anything whilst I was on my trip, it was that it reinforced the idea to me that Americans really loved the NES, and to them it pretty much is 80s gaming. The legendary status of the NES continues to grow the world over now. The hype around this thing never stops growing, what with Nintendo constantly ramming their history down people's throats, big American YouTubers constantly talking about the bloody thing, and most recently the release of the NES Mini. In fact, if you speak about late 80s gaming with most Americans, you would probably feel like the NES was all there was to gaming over that period. But being a highly cultured individual who is part of a civilization that dates back over 5,000 years rather than to 1780, I know that is far from the truth. Yeah! As I pointed out recently in one of my rant videos, I am sick of hearing the same false American hyperbole reiterated time and time again, as if everything that has happened in America over the last 30 years rings true to the rest of the planet, rather than just one small region. We all know the same boring story by now. It has been reiterated by YouTubers time and time again. You know the one, the NES is the greatest system of all time, it saved the video game industry, blah 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 blah. ET games go into a landfill, blah 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 blah. You know, it's all the same by now. Even though this may be a story which only applies to America rather than the greater planet, I can tell you that it's still a lie regardless of where you live. If Nintendo didn't swoop in and take the market share in America, in all likelihood someone like Commodore would have snatched it up anyway. Nintendo certainly didn't save gaming in America. If anything, they monopolised the industry and held back the country from a rich gaming diversity we saw in the likes of Europe over the same period. So yeah, continue to listen to all these YouTubers reminiscing about their childhood memories, etc. But just be aware, when it comes to actual real history of gaming, most of them are talking absolute tripe and most likely out their arses, and are just reflecting on their personal nostalgic memories rather than looking at anything on a more global scale. But anyway, since the majority of big gaming YouTubers are Americans themselves, on the whole, I must say that their culture seems to be about thinking about everything on a very domestic scale, rather than a more global scale like a lot of us Europeans. Most things that happen domestically, they tend to massively exaggerate as well, and blow out of proportion, as if it matters just as much to the rest of the world. I am going to tell you all now that the NES Saviour story is absolute bollocks. It's complete tripe, and you've all been duped. The NES did not save the gaming industry. It didn't even save the gaming industry in America. It just monopolised that market in that particular potsy country. The NES's significance in the 1980s has now been blown completely out of proportion, and the system may not have had quite as much of a global influence as many would think. So whilst the NES is a great system, the console is nowhere near as influential as most people would have you to believe, and it is most certainly not the be-all and end-all of that generation. Regardless of all this, I must say that even in Europe now, NES collecting has become a massive thing, even though very few people have nostalgic memories of the system to look back on. Whilst I agree it is certainly worth collecting for the sheer quality of the games, I believe many people at home have jumped on an American bandwagon and received nostalgia second-hand from the talk of their passionate American YouTubers. I reckon most gamers in England now, particularly those who are quite young, may even now assume that NES was a success at home, just because the same story has been repeatedly told to them online so many times. I love Nintendo, I really do, but I fell in love with the company during the Super Nintendo era. It was the game Street Fighter 2 that inspired myself, along with so many other Brits, to invest in a Super Nintendo console. I used to sit in my uncle's room for hours watching him play that bloody game. Anyway, back on subject, the NES era of gaming. The console that apparently saved the gaming industry in America barely even managed to get off the ground in England. Whilst over in the States upon release, the NES reportedly ended their video game crash. Back home in the UK though, we had never suffered a bloody crash to begin with. Gaming was thriving at the time. So unlike in America, Nintendo were never a white knight coming to save the day. They were just another company in a great war trying to plunder a piece of the gaming market. Speaking of the gaming crash in America, again you could debate if it even really happened. And even if it did, the only consequences in which the consumer would have seen would have been a sharp drop-off in the prices of games. Personally, I think this must have been a fantastic time to be a gamer in the United States, rather than the dark ages in which many people attempt to paint a picture of. So, regardless of this, the arguably mythical video game crash certainly did not affect our own shoreline. Gaming was as popular as ever in the UK at the time, and gaming on microcomputers was a household thing. For those watching today who are either too young or maybe just a little bit simple, a microcomputer was a small, relatively inexpensive computer with a microprocessor as its central processing unit. It included a microprocessor, memory, and minimal input-output circuitry mounted on a single printed circuit board. To put this in simplified terms, these were the bloody PCs of their time. In the UK, microcomputers became popular in the 1970s and 1980s with the advent of the increasingly powerful microprocessors. These machines were known as microcomputers because before that, computers were comparatively much larger and more expensive. You know the kind of computers you see in 1960s James Bond films? They take up whole bloody rooms! Anyway, in regards to these microcomputers, there was a whole array of bloody great options available on the market. Just to name a few of some of the popular devices that were in circulation at home during the NES era, we had the Sinclair Spectrum, the Amstrad CPC 464, the Commodore 64, the Dragon 32, the Amiga, the Atari ST, the 800 XL, and the list goes on and on. Of course you would think by owning a computer, you would use them to process documents, do spreadsheets, blah blah blah, but no, of course not. A large chunk of people ended up buying these systems just to play bloody games. Sure, the odd teenager may have convinced their parents that they wanted to do their homework on one of these things, but we all know that was most likely lies for naughty scallywags. So, back on the subject of Nintendo regarding these things, apart from having to compete with that huge array of popular established microcomputers, Nintendo also had Sega beat them to the market in Europe, with a dedicated games console of their own in the form of the Master System. So if people fancied a games console at the time instead of a microcomputer, they would in all likelihood have already picked up that system instead. By the time the NES made it to the party, their distribution was far inferior to that of Sega. So really, they stood no chance at all. From my personal memories, the only place I ever remember seeing Nintendo stuff for sale as a kid was in Boots Pharmacy, a chain in where you wouldn't even think of picking up a product like that from, even in the first place. So to summarise all the reasons why Nintendo never became a dominant force here in the 1980s are essentially because there was no video game crash, microcomputers were extremely popular, the Master System was released before the NES, and lastly, the NES distribution was absolutely awful. So, that was some of the reasons for you that the NES was less likely to fall into a UK consumer's hands. So now, let's talk about why, even if the NES was marketed successfully, I feel that people still made the right choice on opting for a microcomputer instead. Firstly, the games. The sheer amount of variety on these devices was unparalleled. Here is just one example for you. In America, by the end of the NES's life cycle, the system had around 800 games. However, since the system was a flop in the UK, we sadly only ever received around 200 of those. So to make one side-by-side comparison, you could have gone for the NES, which would have had 200 games, or instead you could have chosen the much more popular ZX Spectrum, which had 24,000 games released. 24,000 games? Could you imagine trying to collect every game for that system? It would be an OCD nightmare! Apart from choice, games for these microcomputers were extremely cheap in comparison to their NES counterparts. You would usually have to pay about £50 for a Nintendo game, and when you bring inflation into the situation, £50 30 years ago was a hell of a lot of money. It is the equivalent of PS4 games being £150 each today. Who in their right bloody mind would ever want to pay that? I'll tell you who. Lunatic Americans! Ha ha ha! Microcomputer games, on the other hand, were usually under £10 each. Many you could get as cheap as £2 each, and even used to get games for free in which would come attached to magazines. That is an absolute bargain in comparison. Also, once you had acquired one of these games, you could simply pop them in a tape deck, make a copy of it, and give a copy to your friend to play at home. This was like the swinging 60s of video game piracy. Everyone was bloody doing it. I remember my Amstrad CPC 464 I had at my house, for example. I had lots and lots of games for it, but the majority of them were bloody copies with handwritten labels on them. Who wants to buy games for the equivalent of 150 bloody quid a pop, when at the time you could just get them for free instead? Who in their right mind would have gone for Nintendo? Not very many people back then, of course. So to get this straight, you have a gaming community who are used to buying games for less than a tenner each, getting loads of games for free and trading and sharing all of their software. Then suddenly a company comes along who literally nobody has ever heard of and expect you to pay a premium and give up playing copies of your games? Of course your system would bloody flop. They didn't bring anything new to the table really. Now to give you a quick summary of the reasons that why in the 80s a microcomputer was a much more sensible choice for gaming than an NES. Firstly, the libraries for these microcomputers were beastly in comparison to that of Nintendo's. There were literally tens of thousands of games for each. Secondly, games were much cheaper. Thirdly, games were easily copied and shared amongst friends. And fourthly, microcomputers were the status quo. We didn't want our bloody options compromised. The things I've just talked about were just some of the reasons for a general consumer to own a microcomputer. Of course you have all the more niche purposes on top of that too, like the fantastic bedroom homebrew communities you had for these devices at the time, and of course all the office and administrative purposes you had for them too. You couldn't do anything like that with the NES. It was a baby's toy in comparison. So overall, us Brits had a lot more choice in the 80s when it came to gaming. We could make informed decisions, and upon the NES's release, no way was such a limited device going to take our microcomputers' places. History now may tell us that the NES ended up receiving an outstandingly fun library of games, but the long gaming sessions of waiting 10 minutes at a time, loading up tapes, will always resonate stronger in the hearts of Europeans who remember the 80s. Due to the unwarranted price differences, the bigger library, the easy piracy and freedom, if I got transported back to the 1980s, I would opt for a microcomputer over an NES every single time. Yeah! Cheerio! Shoutouts to Jarrett Tolzian, Bricky's Lads, Mad 8 Productions, Andreas Larson, Peter Sidorn, Diego Pereira, and all my other patrons. Thank you all for your fantastic support. It is very humbling. If you have yet to see my Patreon page, be sure to check it out. There are some pretty cool rewards for my supporters. If you are brand new and enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button and be sure to click one of the annotations to see some of my other content. Yeah! Ta-ta and farewell.